All right, so from our previous discussions, you learn about the use of the interview and the reference when it comes to making decisions about if you're going to hire someone or not. Okay, and you have realized that using references as a source of information is problematic from the perspectives of the different studies conducted in IO. Now this time, what we're going to take a look at is the use of psychological testing in predicting applicant ability, okay, or applicant performance using the ability of the applicant measured with the use of tests. So ability tests are widely used in the organization, and ability tests are tests that measures your capability, and typically they have right or wrong answers, meaning if you have greater capability, then you will have a higher score or better performance. So ability tests tap the extent to which an applicant can learn or perform a job-related skill. Ability tests are used primarily for occupations in which applicants are not expected to know how to perform the job at the time of hire. So there might be instances wherein you're willing to hire people who are not that competent yet, but you know that with the right training, you'll be able to compensate for that lack of experience or lack of knowledge in the subject area. But what you want to do at this point in time is to know who among these different applicants will have the right competencies to learn what he or she needs to learn. So in other words, using the language of psychological testing, what you're testing at this point in time is the aptitude of the person. So in psychological testing, there are various types of ability tests, namely achievement, intelligence, and aptitude tests. When we say achievement tests, they measure learning that has something to do with the past, or in layman's term, your past or previous learning. So achievement tests are mainly used in the classroom. Intelligence tests are mainly used for psychological evaluation, say for example, clinical evaluation. And intelligence tests, basically, they measure your overall intellectual capability. And sometimes they're also used in counseling setting when they are helping their students to look for a job that will suit their capabilities. And sometimes they're also used in the industrial setting. Like there are some companies I know that use the Ravens progressive matrices. Okay, and other than that, other companies make use of aptitude tests. Or when we say aptitude, they measure your capability to learn something in the future. So, in other words, what we're considering now in ability testing is that who among these various applicants will have the right skills, existing skills, to learn the skills that will be taught in the training. Because in IO, we do know that there's no such thing as a perfect applicant, but training will always be there to compensate for it. And at this point in time, what we want to do is who to determine who among your applicants would be the easiest one to train, okay, by looking at his or her existing competencies that will be measured with the use of psychological evaluation tools and techniques. All right, so the first type of ability that we're going to talk about in psychological testing is cognitive ability, or abilities involving knowledge and the use of information. So basically, all achievement, aptitude, and intelligence tests measure cognitive ability. So when we talk about cognitive ability, what comes into your mind? So perhaps these are the mathematical problems, visual spatial problems, or they may include working memory, manipulating information in your mind, thinking about solutions, problem solving. Basically, they involve the various executive functions that we have. And what is being measured is to what extent can we maximize these different executive functions. So cognitive ability is thought to predict work and work performance in two ways: by allowing employees to quickly learn job-related knowledge and by processing information resulting in better decision making. So the assumption here is that if you have higher intellectual capability or higher IQ, then you will have the higher aptitude to learn and quickly learn what you have to learn in training. So in other words, in layman's term, smarter people will also learn faster. And the second is that people who have a higher IQ will be able to do better in making decisions, especially if their position will involve a lot of decision making skills. Now, what are the possible drawbacks of using cognitive ability tests? Okay, so we know from the psychometric perspective that we need to measure abilities of the applicants with the use of intelligence aptitude measures. However, from the perspective of an applicant who knows nothing about psychometrics, they might wonder why are they being tested with mathematics, with language, with memory, if all of those things do not have anything to do with their job, especially if their job is not so related to those intelligences. Say, for example, his main role is compiling paperworks or interviewing or talking with people as part of customer service. Then as an applicant, I might think that what's the relationship of my aptitude in mathematics with my capability to relate with people. So the first drawback is the lack of face validity. Okay, so in layman's term, face validity refers to you think that the test is related to the purpose of the test. So if the test lacks face validity, it means that the person thinks that the test is not related to the purpose. In this case, to the job. In my case, even though, like in my case, even though I have background in psychology, sometimes I do feel that the testing situation lacks face validity. Like when I applied for graduate school, my aptitude in mathematics and language were tested. Okay, and deep inside during the test, I was thinking, so I know that I'm terrible in mathematics. So if I did perform poorly in mathematics, will they not accept me in graduate school? Because I know that in applying for grad school, what is more important is my ability in psychology related stuff and not my general potentialities for mathematics, language, memories, etc. Okay, so the good news is that I was accepted in grad school even though I'm terrible at mathematics because that's not really, a big part or a big determiner of grad school success. But so that's the issue with the industry. So what if they place a big percentage in the in your performance in cognitive ability tests? Okay, so that's an issue that needs to be addressed. Okay, and the next issue is that it's difficult to set a passing score, especially if no one in the company has background knowledge about interpreting IQ test scores. So how do you know if the person will pass or fail? Okay, are you going to base that on the norms? Are you going to base that on the norms provided in the manual of the test, or are you going to base your passing score on the performance of all your present employees, or are you going to base your passing score on the performance of all your applicants for the past 5 years? So there are a lot of things to consider here. Okay, so say for example, my IQ is 90, but you will only accept people who has an IQ of 100. Okay, so at that point, I know that I have failed, but deep inside, I know that I can work as a good construction worker or as a good architect. But if you only rely on cognitive ability tests, then there are a lot of issues. Okay, so there are a lot of drawbacks here. That's why at the end of the day, do not rely on one basis, okay, when it comes to making decisions in hiring. Next is perceptual ability. Of course, this is still related to cognitive ability. So this is used in professions such as those who are in charge with machines, other professions such as cabinet making, driver, etc. Okay, so these jobs rely on visual spatial intelligence, such as, say, for example, you work in the aviation industry and it's important for you to understand maps. Or, say, for example, you work in a job wherein you'll be required to go around the town and they need someone who will not easily get lost. So that's spatial relations and visual perception. So that's another knowledge that can be tapped in testing or psychological testing in a company. But still, the question remains, there might be instances wherein what's in the test is not does not reflect what will be needed in the job itself. That's why, in my experience, there are some companies in and schools who would prefer to make their own tests rather than buy tests from suppliers or um, from those who sell tests, from test publishers. Say, for example, I know someone from the marine industry who gathered experts from the marine industry to make their own tests in the Filipino setting, to make their tests about different parts of the ship, different functions of the parts of the ship, because they cannot find any test in the market that will suit the purpose of their assessment. Okay, so that's another issue that you have to address. So other than that, we other tests can also measure your manual dexterity or your mastery of your motor coordination or your finger dexterity. So they might be useful in jobs such as carpenters, police officers, sewing machine operators, post office clerks, and truck drivers. So they are the professionals who may benefit from a manual dexterity test, particularly because they may not do well if they are given a cognitive test, especially if they did not do well in school. So, say for example, here in the Philippines, construction workers may not have finished their high school, but still, that does not erase the fact that they are capable in construction work. That's why they need their specific abilities need to be tested, not their general capabilities. Okay, so that's it. You can use manual dexterity in these professions that I've mentioned. Other than that, I can share to you more about cognitive ability testing, especially for these professions. So typically, like what I told you earlier, some of them may not have been able to finish school, high school, or some of them may not have been able to go to college. That's why they are at a disadvantage if you test them using the traditional English tests in English language that are measuring cognitive skills. That's why in some companies, I've heard that they use non-verbal tests because non-verbal tests are less reliant on language. That's why even though you're not that good with English or with any other language, it is expected that you're still going to do well or you're still going to perform considerably well in these tests. So when it comes to these professions such as carpenters or truck drivers, you can make use of nonverbal tests like the Purdue non-language test. All right, so that's for this slide. So let's look at the next ones. Okay, a company may also be interested in measuring your physical ability or your physical prowess. Okay, so they test your physical capabilities like strength, power, agility, speed, etc. Okay, and why do we have to assess your physical abilities? It's because there are jobs that would require your physical gifts. Okay, and there are instances wherein it would be difficult to simulate certain job incidents or certain scenarios while on the job. Say, for example, those who would like to become firefighters will not be trained by exposing them to a real burning house, or we cannot pretend that someone is really getting stuck in a car so that rescuers can be trained how to rescue people in these types of accidents. So what we can do is that we can simulate by measuring their physical abilities through different exercises, just like joining a contest of that measure strength, or like what you can see on Facebook, like those that they do in the world's strongest man. So carrying barrels, speeding your way through an obstacle course, climbing, etc. Okay, and there are some drawbacks with physical ability tests. Some people may think that what you're doing in the practice will not really be applied in the real job. Okay, so say for example, if you're not yet an experienced rescuer or first aider, you may not realize that knowing how to move your way through an obstacle course will actually help you understand how it feels when you are in a challenging situation. Okay, so some people may think that what they're doing is not related to what they need to do on the job itself. Other than that, there are also issues with passing scores. So how do you determine who passes or who fails an obstacle course? Okay, do you base it on speed, on strength, on the quality of their performance, or the quantity of what they have done? So that's a bit difficult to, to establish, and the time at which they should be required. So here's the question. If person A would like to join the army, perhaps he or she would have to go through an obstacle course. However, person A admits that he was not really gifted physically. So what if he wasn't accepted into the army because he failed the obstacle course? But the thing is, that's not really needed that much at the beginning of the training, because person A is willing to learn, or willing to, strengthen himself while he is in the, in the academy. Okay, so here's the question. If you assess physical ability, when is it really needed for that person to display these abilities? Is it necessary to measure these abilities at the start of training, or is it, or will it do to measure these abilities just before they get deployed? So there are a lot of issues that can be discussed. Okay, so that's for physical ability. Okay, so you have seen the various issues when it comes to the use of tests in measuring different capabilities. So now what we can do is that we can predict performance not with the test scores, but rather with applicant skill. In other words, why don't we try to make the person do something or perform a task related to his job, so that we will have an idea how will he be able to do the actual task when he starts on the job. Okay, so the most common methods for doing this are the two, work samples and assessment centers. So let's take a look at them. First, when we say work samples, okay, the applicant performs the actual job related tasks. So there are some simulations, there are some role playing, there are some demonstrations you get to use with the actual machine, etc. So the advantage of that is what you're doing in training or in selection is related to what you're going to do on the job itself. Okay, scores from work samples tend to predict actual work performance and thus have excellent criterion validity. So now you can see that you need to be careful what kind of selection techniques do you maximize. So are you going to maximize tests, or are you going to maximize the use of work samples? So based on this, I hope that you will give more importance to work related tasks over cognitive tests, personality tests, etc. Okay, at the end of the day, we need to get data from various sources. Applicants are able to see the connection between the job sample and the work performed on the job. So that will not only help you select who among them will be the best applicant, but rather it will also give an idea to the applicant what is he or she going to do when he is already part of the company. Okay, so that is for work sample. So this slide shows how useful work sample is when it comes to the selection process. All right, and the other way to assess performance is with the use of assessment centers. So when we say assessment center, with the word center, you may be thinking that center refers to a building or a place or a room in your office, but no, in industrial psychology, when we say assessment center, this is not really a place, a physical place, but rather it's the process of assessment that I've been telling you since earlier. Okay, so when doing assessment, okay, this is characterized by multiple assessment methods that allow multiple assessors to actually observe applicants perform simulated job tasks. So in other words, do not just rely on tests, but rather in assessment center, you use tests, you interview, you use reference and background checks, and then you use work samples and other types of training techniques for you to make a decision whether to hire person A or not. Hopefully the backbone of your assessment center is the work sample, because I've showed you earlier that work sample is one of the best predictors of success on the job that he or she is going to perform in the future. Okay, so now how do you create a good assessment center, or how do you create a good battery of strategies? How do you determine which techniques are you going to include on your assessment center? So first and foremost, like what I've been telling you since earlier, since our earlier discussions, is that we need to do job analysis. So with job analysis, you will understand the purpose and the nature of the job. You will be able to identify what are the different competencies or case house that a person must possess. And based on the case house, you will be able to determine what kind of test will be necessary. Okay, so say for example, you're looking for construction workers, then maybe it will not be your priority to include um, cognitive tests that will require language, what's this? Language proficiency, but rather maximize tests that will, test their strength, test their physical abilities, test their perceptual ability, etc. Okay, and then number two, exercises are developed. So how can we develop exercises? So exercises can fall into one of the following categories: in basket techniques, simulations, work samples, which have already been discussed earlier, and leaderless group discussions. The remaining three will be discussed later on. Okay, so conduct job analysis, decide on exercises that you're going to use, and number three, assessors are chosen to rate applicants going through the assessment center. Of course, you need to hire experts. I mean, you need to get the experts so that they will determine who's going to be hired among the various applicants. All right, so what are the various exercises in an assessment center? First, there is what we call an in-basket technique. When we say in-basket technique, there is a fishbowl, or there is a basket full of problems in papers, and then what you're going to do as an applicant is to pick one of those papers and then unfold it, and then read the problem and basically suggest a possible solution to that problem. So this would be very effective technique for positions that requires good decision making skills, perhaps among managers, etc. Okay, so when you're hiring your next manager, or when you're trying to look for your next executive or your next supervisor, so this would be a good approach. The next is what we call simulation. Okay, well, so when we say simulation, basically this is very similar to work sample, but the difference is that in simulation, it places an applicant in a situation that is similar to the one that will be encountered on the job itself. If we're going to look at other, what's this? We're going to look at other references. They define simulation as working with the actual equipment. Okay, so what we can see here is that basically it's similar with work sample. Okay, so sometimes they are used interchangeably. Okay, but simulation has been defined as well as being exposed to the actual equipment. Say for example, those who are applying to be dressmakers will be exposed to the sewing machine, or those who are applying as psychologists would be exposed to the test materials. Okay, like the Stanford Binet materials, etc. Okay, those who are applying as statisticians will be exposed to the software that they're going to use. So that would be simulation. The next is what we call leaderless group discussion. Okay, wherein a group of applicants will be given a certain problem, and then no one among them will be assigned as a leader, and then they have to talk amongst each other and propose a solution to that problem. And typically those who succeed at this exercise are those who can stand up and lead the rest of the group. So even though it's a leaderless group discussion, leaders emerge in this exercise, and typically those leaders will end up being good employees as well if they're going to get hired. And lastly, we have here what we call business games. So business games is one fun way of designing activities or selecting applicants wherein you can deliver your simulation in term of a game, but in reality I haven't really encountered selection companies who use this selection technique. The closest experience that I've had to a business game happened when I was in the teacher's orientation. So that's not selection anymore because we are already deployed, but this is a close example. We've had an orientation about data privacy law or the Data Privacy Act. And then after that, I was expecting a typical post test, but the speaker prepared an online test wherein for every question, the correct answer will be displayed on the screen, and then they're going to show who among the applicants or who among the teachers got the correct answer, and then they're going to crown the first placer. Okay, so that's the closest experience that I've had to a business game. Okay, so now let's take a look at another way to predict performance is to look at prior experience. So the first thing that we talk about in selection is the interview. This was followed by references, by past performance from the viewpoint of another, and this was followed by the different psychological tests. Okay, test performance. Now this time, why don't we look at prior experience? Okay, so these are the typical ways to assess prior experience: resume information, biodata, reference checks. We have somehow this technique makes its way once again in our discussion and interviews, which have been detailed already in the previous lesson entitled Recruitment and Interviewing. All right, so here's an example of biodata. So there are questions here in the screen, and typically biodata sheets are provided sometimes by the company or sometimes by the individual who is applying. But in my experience, I provided the resume and the company provided a biodata sheet to me, and then I had to fill it up during the application process. So it's characterized by having, typically it has some structured questions, and then there are some check boxes that you have to select which of them applies to you. Okay, so in other words, other than the information they're getting from the resumes, sometimes company would like to assess the information they in their own way by providing their own questionnaire through the biodata. All right, so here are other sources of information. So there can be what we call personality inventories, or when you apply, you can be your personality, your big five can be assessed, or your 16 traits with the use of 16 PF can be assessed, and there are other personality inventories out there that are not so that are less known compared to the NeoPi and the 16 PF, like the basic personality inventory, and there are a lot of tests out there. Now the only question here is that, do you fail people based on personality inventories? So if you know someone who works in the HR, of course I can only give my perspective, but it would be nice if you can ask someone else if what can they share about their experience. So do they fail people who did not perform well in a personality inventory? Because at the end of the day, personality tests do not have right or wrong answers. So maybe it would be, insightful if you're going to ask some practitioners that the question about how do they utilize personality test results in their company. Because as we know, there are some positions or jobs that would require a certain trait. For example, flight attendants and pilots um, should not be neurotic. They should be emotionally stable. Okay, so obviously if you're neurotic, then you have a lesser chance of being hired or being accepted. Okay, so that's just one example that I know. But what about the other jobs wherein the personality requirements are not so obvious? Okay, because there are typical jobs like being in the office, and we don't know to what extent do we need to possess a certain characteristic. So the question here is that, so what's the use of personality inventories in their institution? Do they even use it to decide whether to hire the person or not? So that's an open question to everyone who's listening to this discussion. Okay, so here is what research is saying about personality inventories. So personality can predict performance at low but statistically significant levels. So like what I've been telling you, it doesn't correlate that highly with performance because other things will help predict performance. Okay, other things are better predictors. That's what I mean, like cognitive ability or if even prior experience. Next, personality inventories can add incremental validity to other selection tests. So perhaps to answer my own question earlier about the use of personality inventory, so what our author Amot is saying here is that even though personality inventories is only correlates at a low level with performance, at least it adds something. Okay, incremental validity means that if you give a new test, it will give you a new information that haven't been given to you already by other tests. Okay, so in other words, incremental validity will help us discover more about the applicant. Although I don't think that it will give you a lot of new information. Just a just a small amount of new information. And sometimes they're helpful for certain professions. Okay. But at the end of the day, like what I've been telling you since earlier, we need to use multiple techniques. Okay. Other than that, amongst the big five, the best predictor in almost any occupation of being successful is conscientiousness. Okay, so if you're conscientious, then expect good things will come your way because you're very hardworking. The only downside of knowing this information from this lecture is that there might be people who will try to manipulate their personality test answers to make themselves look more conscientious. That's why, as a professional in psychology, I'm telling you that do not rely on a single measure because things might get fishy if people are trying to manipulate their information while applying in your company. Okay, and the validity of the other four personality dimensions is dependent on the type of job. So in other words, consensuousness is the most useful in predicting any other occupation, but the rest of the four depends on the type of the job. So sometimes agreeableness is important, sometimes it's not. So we cannot generalize and say that all jobs will benefit from having an agreeable person. Because say for example, you're a security personnel, it won't be helpful if you're agreeable because what if you're so forgiving or you're so trusting that you're letting criminals go or you're letting people with guns enter the mall? Okay, so agreeableness might not be the best trait in the profile of a security personnel. Okay, so that's just one example. Okay, and then other than that, we can also administer what we call integrity tests or also known as honesty tests. Okay, so they are tests designed to predict the tendency to steal because in real life, people might be tempted when they're exposed to the money of the company, especially if your company is multi-millionaire. You belong in a rich company, or your role is that you're a treasurer or you're a cashier or you collect money for some reason, believe it or not, in real life, people might be tempted when they have their personal problems and they require financial assistance. If they have a history of, using money in the wrong way, then they might be tempted to borrow some money from the company without the knowledge of the owner or the executives. So technically, they're stealing. Okay, so it might be helpful if you're going to consider integrity tests or honesty tests in your company. Okay, because it is no longer ethical to use lie detector tests. That's why now we use personality tests or other ways to assess the honesty of an applicant. Okay, so that's it. Maybe you can include integrity questions in your interview, like give me an example of a time that you have been honest in your other work, etc. Okay, so this is a suggestion to all of you who are listening. You might consider adding integrity tests in your selection methods. And then here are other techniques that we use. Drug testing, of course. Is there a history of drug use? So typically here in the Philippines, what we do is that we require people to undergo physical exam. Okay, so that covers X-rays, stool tests, urine tests, drug tests, possibility of having high blood pressure, etc., and different existing um, scanning the presence of different illnesses or chronic diseases. What's the good news is that recently companies are also requiring their applicants to undergo psychological testing. So that's good news for the psychology professionals in the Philippines. And medical exams. Okay, here in our country, it's already included in the drug testing. So these two are collectively known as physical exams. Okay, so or medical in layman's term. They call it you need to undergo medical examination. Okay, so that is it. In other sources of information from using drug tests, psychological testing, and medical exams. Okay, once you have made a decision, of course, someone will be hired and someone will not be accepted, or in other words, rejected in the application process. So once a decision has been made regarding which applicant will be hired, those who will not be hired must be notified. Because typically, when a company decides not to accept your application, they typically don't give you any feedback. So speaking from the ethics perspective, the applicant needs to be aware of his status. Okay, his application still being considered? Okay, rejected applicants should be treated well because they are potential customers and potential applicants for other positions. So it won't um it will be beneficial. Okay, nothing will be lost if you're going to treat your rejected applicants well, because you don't know, maybe he or she will be interested to apply again in the future in case you're going to have another opening. Okay, so those are some things to remember when rejecting applicants. Okay, so here are some things to remember when rejecting applicants with the use of rejection letters. According these suggestions are based on the recommendations of Amott in his book. Okay, so the first thing is that it helps if the rejection letter is personally addressed and it is signed by the one who is supposed to send rejection letters. Okay, so it just doesn't say dear sir or ma'am, but rather it would be more heartfelt if it says dear Mr. and then his or her his surname. Okay, so that helps from time to time. And number two, the company's appreciation for the applicant. Of course, you have to express your gratitude for his or her interest in applying for your company. Okay, because even he or she wasn't hired, of course, you need to appreciate that people are trying to apply for your company, so that if they felt appreciated, then they're going to put out a good word about your selection process, that even though they did not get hired, they were not hired by the company, at least they know that this company treats um, their applicants well. Okay, the next is that a compliment about the applicant's qualifications. So what's another good thing to do is, even though the person wasn't able to be hired in your company, at least tell him what are his strengths so that he can continue working on those strengths when he applies in another company in the future. And next, a comment about the qualifications possessed by the other applicants. So if you were not hired as a teacher in my school and then person B was hired, it would be helpful if I give you a short profile about person B so that you will know what is the real reason why you were not hired. So this is not because of any injustice or any bias, but rather you will realize that you did not make a mistake at any point during the application, but rather you were not hired or you were not selected because person B possess better qualifications in comparison to you. Okay, so at least you will not doubt yourself or your skills. You just know that in that situation, if if you're the recruiter, it would be better to select person B when it comes to experience. Now, next is that information. I mentioned this already. Information about the person that was actually hired, and a wish of good luck in their future endeavors, and a promise if you're planning to keep the applicant's resume on the file, then you can tell that to him or her that his application will be considered in the future. You just need to be honest with your applicants about your plans with their documents. And here's the summary of what we have discussed in the past two topics about references and about testing and other sources of information when selecting applicants. So references are typically not good predictors of performance due to various factors such as leniency, poor reliability, fear of legal ramifications, and a variety of extraneous variables. Reliability, validity, cost, and potential for legal problems should be considered when choosing the right type of employment test for a particular situation. So you need to be able to select which of the available tests is the most suited for your present purpose, okay, for your goal, for your objective. Other than that, cognitive ability tests, job knowledge tests, biodata, work samples, assessment centers are some of the techniques in predicting future performance. Other than that, we can also make use of drug testing and medical exams, and writing a well-designed rejection letter can have important organizational consequences. All right, so those are the things that I want you to learn and remember about the selection process. So what I would like you to realize is that even though we have been doing selection for quite some time and it has been there in the HR as part of the processes, there are still issues that needs to be resolved, particularly when it comes to the use of selection techniques. Okay, and there are a lot of issues when it comes to the reliability and validity of these methods, especially if we only rely on one method when making decisions. Okay, of course, just like what you learn in psychological assessment, hiring, or testing should be done in a problem solving approach, meaning you will not just rely on scores or in one performance in a single area, but rather it's like pieces of the puzzle being connected to each other so that you will arrive at a better decision. Okay, in various areas of assessment, such as clinical, such as legal, but in this context, even in industrial, that problem solving approach in assessment would be very, very useful in selecting the best applicant for the position. So that is it for selection and the different techniques. Thank you.